Everyone, well, it's great to have the Prime Minister in town, and a lot's been said about Cross River Rail, but unless you get underneath and see exactly what's happening, it is a transformational project. 7,000 jobs over the life of the project. We've got over 2,600 people at the moment currently being employed on the project at 15 different sites. And of course, the Gabba station that we are observing today is absolutely going to be transformed, especially leading into the Olympics. There'll be a beautiful walkway to the Gabba Stadium, but this project is transformational. It's Brisbane's own underground, and it's going to leave a lasting legacy for many, many years to come. It's great to have the Prime Minister here, and I'll hand over to Albo to talk to you all.
Well, thanks very much, Premier, and it's great to be joined by yourself, the Deputy Premier, and Minister Bailey, as well as my colleague, the member for Moreton, Graham Perrott, because this is a project that shows us what good government looks like. It looks like this: an infrastructure project that will transform Brisbane, that will boost productivity, that's creating in excess of, directly, over 7,000 jobs at this project. There are currently over 2,500 Queenslanders working on this project. And I look back at lost opportunities and what happens when you change government. Because when Campbell Newman was elected and then Tony Abbott was elected, this project got put on the shelf. This necessary project to drive productivity and growth here throughout southeast Queensland, because this project increases the capacity of the entire network. But the Queensland government, by itself it must be said, no federal money in this project, has got on with the job, as Labor governments do, of being concerned about creating jobs, in this case for Queenslanders and for Australians. So whilst coalition leaders create jobs for themselves, this project is an example of creating jobs for Queenslanders. And that's why I'm here today, and why I'm spending a few days back in Queensland again. Tomorrow I'll be in the Torres Strait, and on Friday I'll be in Rockhampton in the lead up to the Jobs and Skills Summit. This is an example as well where projects that receive federal funding in future will receive a guarantee of 10% of the workforce being apprentices, making sure that we train Australians for those jobs, that we skill up our workforce. So I want to work very closely with the Palaszczuk government on infrastructure projects, particularly in the lead up to the Olympics. It's a great opportunity for the whole of Queensland, but indeed for Australia, to showcase what we can do for the world, both on the field and in the pool and on the track, but also in the infrastructure area, in creating a world-class event that Australia can do better than anywhere else in the world. And I look forward to watching the development over coming years. I do want to say as well that the Jobs and Skills Summit is taking place. We are having forums today in Canberra. There's a forum from disability workers, and it's examining the ways in which we can increase the employment of people with disabilities and also skill up people. I spoke to a forum last night, but throughout Australia we're having regional meetings, we're having meetings aimed at particular sections of the community, talking about how we can expand jobs and skills, how we can lift wages. We know that today's figures show a 3.5% decline in real wages, with the wage figure of 2.6 compared with the annual inflation rate of 6.1. It's another reminder that wages were going backwards. There was no plan to lift wages. We want to work with business, to work with unions, to work with the non-government sector to advance Australia's interests going forward. Happy to take questions.
Scott Morrison insists appointing himself to 5 additional portfolios with the shield election from unforeseen challenges. And the fact that he didn't need to tell most ministers was because he didn't need to exercise the power that he wasn't with him. What are your thoughts on this? And do you have any further information on what instructions were made as to why the documentation wasn't published?
Well, the first rule of Power Grab Club is don't talk about power grab club. And Scott Morrison broke that rule today. Scott Morrison was evasive, he was defensive, he was passive-aggressive, and of course he was self-serving. So at least he was true to himself today. What we saw was all of his characters on full display, blaming everyone else, not accepting any responsibility, saying, for example, that somehow when he said he was taking the decision on the resources as Resources Minister, when he said, I'm making this decision as Prime Minister, everyone should have known at that point in time somehow that he had sworn himself in as the Resources Minister in order to make that decision. His extraordinary comments that he said, where he gave a press conference and said that he made the conscious decision to not tell his cabinet colleagues that he had also occupied their space as Treasurer, as Finance Minister, as Industry, Science, Energy and Resources Minister, as Home Affairs Minister, that somehow he didn't want it to be misinterpreted, which is why he didn't tell anyone. The fact is there were at least 3 documents provided. The Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, I wrote to them today, asking that in the public interest, after questions have been raised with the Department and with myself at yesterday's press conference, that it be released, the documentation of appointment signed by the Governor-General. Those documents have now been released. Why there wasn't any statement made at the time is incomprehensible to me. It is a government not being transparent, and this was a shadow government. It's one thing to have a shadow ministry. This was a shadow government, so that Josh Frydenberg and Matthias Cormann and Karen Andrews and others weren't even told, nor were the secretaries of departments like Treasury and Home Affairs. So that when the incident occurred on May 21, where you had that release of the text messages about at the arrival of a boat, Karen Andrews, who'd got the phone call, according to her, from Scott Morrison asking for a release to be made in breach of what had been the government policy, including under Minister Morrison when he had responsibility for that. He, at no stage did we know that Minister Morrison had in fact been appointed as Minister for Home Affairs as well. Now, it's one thing for his ministerial colleagues to not be told, and I noticed in the part of the press conference that I watched, and I watched most of it before we began the event here today, Mr Morrison spoke about apologising to his ministerial colleagues for how they felt. Not that he'd done anything wrong, he accepted no responsibility. But how about an apology to the Australian people? The Australian people went to an election not knowing that any of this had occurred, not knowing that there was a shadow government operating in darkness without transparency, a clear misleading of the parliament whereby parliamentarians and ministers are held to account for areas in which they have responsibility. We ask questions about PEP 11, specifically in the House of Representatives, and at no stage did Minister Pitt or Prime Minister Morrison at the time say, well, actually that was a decision made by Minister Morrison, not as Prime Minister, but as Minister for Resources. Well, I've asked for an opinion from the Solicitor General. The question for Mr Morrison is, what advice did he get from the Solicitor General before he made these decisions? We know that he made a request of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. The Prime Minister and Cabinet Department provided a brief for him to sign. He then signed off on a letter to the Governor-General, and the Governor-General made the appointments upon the recommendation of the government of the day. We will receive that advice, I'm advised, on Monday. That will be considered advice from the Solicitor General, and that is appropriate because there are reasons why there are checks and balances in our democratic system. The reason why you have one minister who's responsible for making decisions about resources or about environment or about immigration, and by being sworn in, of course, to the Home Affairs portfolio, it also confuses that role potentially as well. The legal implications for this will be considered by the Solicitor General. That advice will come to the government, and we'll make decisions about a way forward based upon that. But this only came about, be very clear, this came about because Scott Morrison was getting a biography written of him with a couple of journalists who published this on Saturday, and then bit by bit information came out. And yesterday morning, Scott Morrison on 2GB said he couldn't recall any additional appointments beyond the 3 which had already been released. Now, he couldn't remember the fact that he had been appointed to administer the Treasury portfolio and the Home Affairs portfolio. I mean, give me a break. This is a guy who, and a government with Peter Dutton sitting there, and yesterday Peter Dutton said very clearly that basically everyone should just move on. It was like nothing to see here. We've just had this shadow government operate, but ask me questions about something else, please. Well, he sat there in the cabinet as well when Scott Morrison was appointed himself as the sole member of a cabinet committee simply so that he could avoid scrutiny in any meetings that he held with other ministers. He could say they'd been co-opted onto that committee of one. It's a farce. This was a slippery slope that Scott Morrison went down, that Peter Dutton and the rest of his cabinet went along with. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year for 4 years. For 4 years, this guy stood at press conferences and said, for example, in the United States, the issue of invites to the White House was just gossip when he knew that it wasn't gossip, it was fact.
Where were the investigation be able to reveal if Mr Morrison uses powers as Prime Minister other than that Chapter 11 project, or does it not have the scope to do that?
I've asked for advice about that, but quite clearly, given the fact that Mr Morrison wasn't even transparent yesterday morning on 2GB, then I don't think it's possible to take what he has said at face value. So we will ask for, we've asked for advice. We await that advice.
Where might that advice go to?
It's not my position as Prime Minister. I have no intention of undertaking any criticism of the Governor-General. The Governor-General acted in accordance with the recommendations of the government of the day. The government of the day has to accept responsibility for this, and the people who were involved in it directly have to accept responsibility. If there are any changes that are required or recommended from any future examination of this, and quite clearly it does need to be examined. It's not in spite of what Peter Dutton thinks is appropriate. It's not going to just move on here. This is fundamentally a trashing of our democratic system, a trashing of the conventions and rules that have operated in Australia for 121 years. This is unprecedented, and that is why our democracy is in retreat worldwide. I don't know if other people have noticed that. There are people fighting now in Ukraine to protect democracy and a sovereign nation. You have a rise of undemocratic regimes. We cannot be taken for granted. Our democracy is precious. We need to defend it and strengthen it, not undermine it, which is what the former government has done.
When might that
Prime
advice
Minister
go?
of Australia's Parliament, do you think there is a place in that Parliament as the current Member of Court?
I think if I was if I was a voter in Cronulla or Caringbah, and I heard my local member say that he didn't follow day-to-day politics, then I think I would want something a bit better than that.
Where might that advice go to, Prime Minister? The advice from the Solicitor General, you get a number. Where might that go?
I don't second guess. The difference between me and the former government is that I am running an orderly, proper government that obeys the rules and conventions of the Westminster parliamentary system. Part of that is issues of taking proper advice. We've asked for advice through the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet from the Solicitor General. That is an appropriate course to take, and I won't preempt that. I'll await that advice.
Mr. Albanese, you talked about the benefits of Cross River Rail. One big sticking point here in Queensland has been the cost of it. Is the federal government prepared to commit any extra funds to Cross River Rail or any other infrastructure projects here in Queensland?
We had an agreement in place. We actually had a signed MOU here with the Queensland government. It began under the former Labor government, then the government changed. The government of Campbell Newman I met with a number of times, and Scott Emerson was the State Minister at the time. We came to an agreement of $715 million each, level of government, and then an availability payment going on for a considerable period of time. That was a fair while ago that occurred, more than a decade ago. This is a project that's underway now. But I will have constructive discussions about new projects with Premier Palaszczuk, as I will with other state and territory governments as well. But we will prioritise as well projects that boost productivity like this one.
On that, Infrastructure Australia initially said that because the business case for this project didn't stack up.
That's not right. That's not right. That is not right. That is not right. Infrastructure Australia had this project as its #1 priority on the Infrastructure Australia priority list. #1 in the entire country. This is a nonsense, just like the 3 projects in the East Coast capitals that required investment were all about clogging the centre, if you like. So in Melbourne, it was the Melbourne Metro project. In Sydney, it was how to expand the capacity of the city circle, and they're dealing with that through the Metro project. And here it was Cross River Rail, because it isn't just about what's happening here at the station. It's about the entire capacity of the network, which is why the BCR was so positive for this project. And Tony Abbott and the coalition, preferred to fund projects that were based upon the electoral map, rather than based upon productivity-boosting infrastructure.
Can I get Torres straight?
Sure.
Can you tell us who you plan to meet with up there and how that will inform your preparations for the referendum?
Yeah, I'm meeting the Torres Strait Regional Authority there. We'll go to Thursday Island tomorrow, and we'll also have a Come One, Come All forum there in the afternoon. I want to engage with Australians, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, to consult with them. I gave a substantial speech in Gabba. I'm very pleased that, and I thank Premier Palaszczuk for her support, but I thank all of the premiers across the political spectrum have all indicated their support for recognising Indigenous Australians in our Constitution and having an enshrined voice to the Parliament. But it's now time to have those consultation mechanisms. Linda Burney today is meeting with State and Territory Aboriginal Affairs ministers in Canberra, I think is where the venue is taking place, and she will be travelling with us tomorrow up to the Torres Strait.
Can I get a question of the Premier, if that's okay?
Sure.
Yep, I'll take.
Sorry.
Yep.
Premier, mining giant BHP says it has shelved plans for cooking coal mine due to the new royalties regime. Treasurer Cameron Dick has rubbished the argument. Do you think this conversation could have been avoided if the government had consulted with the industry or given them the courtesy of a heads up?
Look, the Treasurer did consult with the Resources Council about this, And of course, at the moment, some of our resource companies are making record profits. And what we're doing is we're asking them to pay a little bit more during these boom times, and that is going to the people of Queensland. The people of Queensland own this resource, and this money is being used for our hospitals and our schools, and I think every fair-minded Queenslander would agree with that. Yes.
Can you give a guarantee that's the only option on the table for you? Say, have you received some sort of guarantee on the funding from the Prime Minister? And if it does go ahead, what's the future of these bills?
Sure. Look, we've spoken, and the Prime Minister and I will continue to have very good discussions about the commitments of joint funding between the Commonwealth and the state in relation to some venues which are legacy projects, such as the rebuild of the Gabba. It is very important. It is something that I spoke about to the International Olympic Committee and something that we signed up to. In relation to the school, I can understand that there are some preliminary concerns of parents. The Education Minister is engaging with that school, and there will be thorough consultation with that school about if that school does need to move.
Is it likely to be included in any redevelopment plans? Or is
Sorry?
Is it likely to be included in any redevelopment plans, or is that probably not feasible?
Look, the consultation process on the Gabba redevelopment hasn't even started. We had some preliminary concept designs, but it's also very exciting because what you see is the underground here will be connected to the Gabba. You'll be able to walk across from the train station all the way over to the Gabba above the road, and it'll be a fantastic legacy for Queensland following on from the Olympics as well.
Now, when was the last time you lobbied the Prime Minister for a 50-50 split on general health funding? Are you still advocating for that?
We always talk collaboratively about health. And you may remember the first meeting we had where we spoke about how important health was. The Prime Minister put money on the table. That's the first time that's happened. And can I say, all premiers and first ministers really enjoy this constructive dialogue and conversation that we have now with this Prime Minister. It's the best that we've ever had.
Are you getting a fair deal without that 50-50 funding though?
We are getting a fair deal, and don't forget too, we've actually put in over $9 billion in health infrastructure in our budget. And of course there are other issues that I know that the federal government's looking at in relation to how do we get more trained GPs out to our rural and regional areas. The Medicare rebate scheme is also something that is going to be looked at. So look, these are issues that we understand that there are pressures on our national health system. But isn't it good news to hear that we're coming off this wave? And I do want to publicly thank all of our doctors and nurses, everyone out there who's been dealing with this pandemic for the last 2.5 years. They really deserve the public's thanks.
Premier, how confident are you seeing it come into Queensland?
You might want to step offside for this one.
That's weird.
Look, I really hope, Peter V'landys is an honourable man. We have a very good relationship, and I think that he will give serious consideration to the hosting of the grand final, and we stand willing, able to step up if the NRL board deems that to be the case.
The government obviously wants to hold more than one here, but will you be happy if they offer you a deal with just one grand final?
I'd be happy with 1, 2 or 3, and the people of Queensland love their footy. And I can guarantee this, if the final is held here, the Prime Minister will still attend.
Can you talk about an infrastructure agency?
Just 2 more, I've got to get back to Parliament. Yeah, sorry. Yes. I think everyone realises that housing is a big issue everywhere. And look, the Prime Minister's going up to the Torres Strait. The cost of building in some of our rural and remote communities is a big issue. We need the skilled force. That's why we've got the Skills Summit coming up there. It's about empowering our local communities to be able to build things in their own backyards. Yep. Just one. I've got to go. So one more. Any for me? Yes, last one. Thank you.
Sorry.
And I'll leave the Prime Minister here with you.
Yeah,
I've got Parliament. Yeah.
Last year there was discussion of having an independent Olympic infrastructure agency set up to evaluate different infrastructure plans.
Yep.
Is that still the intention?
Look, we're talking about the mechanism, the governance mechanism around that. We'll continue those discussions. But, can I just say that we delivered a very good Commonwealth Games working collaboratively with the federal government, and we actually got things built on time, on budget, and in fact I think there was a small savings component. So I'm very confident that working with this Prime Minister we will deliver the best Olympic Games ever. I'll just leave. I have to...
Sorry, just regarding the Advisory Committee report that came out, the number of women and young people incarcerated in the last 15 years has tripled. Is that a matter of concern? What's your response?
I'll have a look at that report, but I will say that former Justice Margaret McMurdo's report is actually looking at women and girls in the criminal justice system. So we'll be going through that report. It'll be coming into Cabinet very soon for our consideration. Thank you, everyone. I have to go to Parliament. Last one. Oh, only because you're polite. Yeah. You're all polite today. It's because the Prime Minister's in town. Yeah. No, that's a serious issue. No, thank you.
Is it time? I mean, I know you've reviewed your justice and put some steps in place.
Yeah.
Are they not working? Do you need to go again?
Look, we don't want to see these incidents happening. Young people should be at home. They shouldn't be out on the streets. Look, the police are doing everything that they can, and we've got tough laws, and the magistrates have those powers to enforce those laws. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Well, the Premier has indicated that the first National Cabinet meeting we had, I extended the funding for health at a substantial cost of around about $900 million of additional funding. At that time also what we said was that we'd look at, wasn't just about the money, it was also about the structure of our health system. One of the problems that emergency departments have is that people in aged care end up in ED because there's no nurses in our nursing homes. And that is just one example of a problem which is there. The other problem is, of course, access to GPs. People go to hospital because they can't get access to a bulk billing GP. That's why we're setting up urgent care clinics, 50 of them around the country that will bulk bill. That is about taking pressure off emergency departments in our hospital networks. So there's a range of spending that we've got. In addition to that, $750 million on primary health care that we'll do over 3 years, worked out in conjunction with the Royal Australian College as well as the AMA. My government is very committed to strengthening Medicare. We'll work cooperatively with state and territory governments, working those issues through.
Mr. Morrison, you mentioned that you want the... Sorry, Ms. Albany dealt with
I dealt with that issue. I'm also not the Energy Minister, the Resources Minister, the Treasurer, the Finance Minister, the Home Affairs Minister, the Science Minister. Do I leave anything out? The Health Minister as well. I'm just the 31st Prime Minister, but go ahead, please.
Sorry. You mentioned that you had watched Scott Morrison's press conference.
Somewhat, yeah, I couldn't watch it all.
Is it in your view that he does not yet grasp the unprecedented nature of what has occurred?
It is very clear that he doesn't. One of the things that I heard him say, and it struck me as just extraordinary, I wrote it down. Only I could understand the weight of responsibility of what was happening in the pandemic. I reckon that people who are nurses, people who are working in aged care, people who were working in emergency services, our retail workers, those who lost loved ones, those who had affected directly by the pandemic, I reckon they knew the weight of what was occurring in this country. Not just Scott Morrison. And I found that in that one sentence, it said everything about how this atrocious, appalling undermining of democracy happened. Because for Scott Morrison, it was always about him. And that statement I just found absolutely extraordinary. He also said that Australia was a great democracy. Well, he treated it as anything but that. He failed. As I said, it's one thing what he didn't tell other departments, ministers, etc. But he didn't tell the Australian people what was going on with the structure of their government. Their government. No one owns the government. It's owned by the Australian people. That's the way democracies work.
Torres Strait Company.
Look, the head of the Home Affairs Department has said that he didn't know, as did the Minister for Home Affairs as well. That, of course, is a national security portfolio. But people did know that he established a cabinet committee of one. People did know that a range of things that he said over his period as Prime Minister simply were not true. Simply were not true. You had a circumstance whereby the issue of going on leave. I went on leave last week. People decided. I told people I was going on leave. Richard Marles was acting as Prime Minister. You might recall, people didn't even know who was the acting Prime Minister during that time, because this was a government that was addicted to secrecy, that didn't feel like it had to be accountable to the Australian people. I might take just one more.
You're going up to the Torres Strait tomorrow, and you're due to have PNG Australia Ministerial Forum in Wimwak with Prime Minister Morales.
Yes.
In September. What are the
There's not a date been finalised for that. There's not a date been finalised. He hadn't been elected as Prime Minister at that time, you might recall. So I have been in contact with Prime Minister Marape and congratulated him on his election. It wasn't possible to finalise the details, but I look forward to visiting PNG when it is possible, when it's organised. But as well, there's a rugby league game taking place in this great city of Brisbane in September as well, and I have issued an invitation to Prime Minister Marape to attend the PM's 13 game.
My question to the Prime Minister was, what issues are you going up to the Torres Strait to find out about, to meet with Mr Marape and discuss it to the Minister report?
Well, no. I'm visiting the Torres Strait, not PNG, and I'll be talking to the Torres Strait Islanders about the issue of the voice, but also other issues as well. I think that it's important that the Australian Prime Minister talk with people in every region of Australia, and that we're accountable for that. And that's why I'm visiting, along with Senator Nita Green, who of course is based in far north Queensland, and as well with Linda Burney. And I look forward to constructive dialogue. I was a member of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Affairs Committee of the Parliament that conducted an inquiry into a greater autonomy for Torres Strait Islanders, and some of that report lay dormant, unfortunately, but there's a range of suggestions. I look forward to constructive dialogue while I'm up there. Thanks very much.